In this video, we'll implement role-based authorization, and it continues off the previous video where we've used NestJS and Postgres to implement authentication. So we made the ability and the endpoints to register a user, hash their password, and store it in the database. And there's also a type or a role corresponding to that user, and by default it auto-generated to a user. Now I've created this second user here and I've made the role an admin type. So currently I'm logged in as the user, john@hotmail.com. So let's just go through the steps again. You generate the token by hitting the endpoint based on that credentials. You copy and paste that token as a bearer token into the API endpoint that we're protecting, and then when you send it you get the 403 forbidden resource, so it guards that resource for us because we're not actually eligible to make that or authorized to make that request. However, if I sign into John2 and then I copy that token for the admin user and then I go ahead and try and make the request now, and if I just change the body to 24, we do indeed get back the response object and it's created. So let's just go ahead and check that in the user table. So I'll view all rows there. The feed post table. And right at the bottom here for the second user, I've got the body with 24 there. So we can see that that request did work. And if we're just to look at the code ahead of time, just to see what we're working towards in this video, in addition to the JWT guard that we've set here, we've set the auth guard for the roles guard, and then we've put this second decorator for extra metadata that this roles guard uses based on the type of role that they are, or that we're trying to protect for. So in this case, we are saying that you have to be an admin to be able to make a request, and otherwise it will fail. So let's go ahead and get started. So returning to our folder structure, we'll just cd from the root directory into our API. And from here, this is where we're going to want to generate a guard using the NestCLI and also a decorator. So I'm going to do this before I start running the server. So you can use NestGD for decorator. Now if we take a look at our folder structure, I got this auth folder here where I've been doing the auth related stuff. So I'm going to generate the decorator, i.e. the metadata or the @ symbol above the request, so we can have our own custom decorator. So in a decorators folder, I'm going to have a decorator called roles, and like always I want the folder structure to be in a flattened out version so there's no nested folders and no test files. So we've got this decorator here, and the second thing I'm going to generate is the guard, so NestGGU, and in the auth folder, in the guards folder, we're going to have roles. And I'll just add these extra flags on again. So as we've done in the previous video, we've set up the JWT guard and implemented the JWT strategy. So you need to have a valid JWT token as the endpoint to guard against an endpoint, but now we're going to add the authorization on top of that. So even if you have a token, you need to be a particular type of user. So I'm going to start off here in the models, and in the models, actually I've implemented this in a previous video because I've set up the table, but just to recap, I've set up a enum that I've exported here, and there's going to be a user, a premium user, and an admin, and they correspond to the lowercase string. And in the user entity, there is actually a relation to this, well, there's a column for that enum, for that role. And that's what we've seen in the Postgres database when we're looking at the particular user. And by default, it's making it as the user. So if you want to make them admin, you will just have to change that in the database. So since we've got the model or the enum set up for us, we can go ahead and take a look at the decorator that we've just created. So in this roles.decorator, we just want to make a couple of adjustments here. The first thing we want to do is we want to export as a constant. So we'll make it all uppercase, the roles key. And this more or less is just refactoring this part here out like that, because we're going to reuse this variable in another location. So that means we can use this roles key variable here where we're setting metadata. And then we, instead of calling this args, we can call this roles. And this is going to be of the type role, or the array of roles, because it's going to consider all of the roles, because you can pass in more than one role in the guard. So before we've seen that we had the @roles, which is @roles is the name of this variable here that we're exporting. So this is the decorator name, or the metadata that we're adding with that decorator. And then the metadata we're decorating is based on this roles, and it's going to be, so we use the spread operator because we could have a number of roles here in an array. So we could pass in, maybe we want the admin and a premium user to see a certain feature, but we don't want a regular user to see a certain feature. And then if we pass those both in, then we'll get an array of role back. Now it could be that we get none or one, but we will still need to account for the fact that we may want to be using multiple things. So that's our decorator. Now, what I'll add now is I'll add, basically with that decorator, we can see in our feed controller. So we've used this JWT guard here, but what we want to do is now we want to use the roles decorator that we just created. So we can do that, and to use a decorator, we use this @ symbol like before, and the type that we want to pass in here is based on our role enum. So in our first instance, we would want to get the role. We want to protect this route such that only admins can view this. So that means we need to control period and import this. So we've got role from the models, and I might just move the imports around slightly. So, but to use this, now by itself, this is basically doing nothing because it's not actually guarding anything. We've used this decorator and we've provided a little bit of metadata to this particular route here, but nothing's happening based on that. So what we need to do, and this isn't created yet, but preemptively I'm going to put this roles guard in here and start to work on that. Actually, I think we did create it, but we haven't implemented the functionality that we need for that. So if we open up the guard in the auth section, we see we have this newly created role guards. Now it is important that you, if it's not already in the module, to add it to the module. And in our case it isn't, so it's always good to check. I find that sometimes the CLI does add things, sometimes it doesn't. So it's always good just to spend a few seconds just to check and import that. And with that, as we've added as a provider, So it's available in our auth section, so we're able to use it. So we can work on the logic in the roles guard, and this is the main meat of the logic that we're implementing here. So basically, by default, when you have a guard generated by the CLI, it extends can activate. And if you're familiar with Angular, it's a very similar concept. The class it extends, it requires you to, or the interface, it requires you to use this can activate method. Otherwise, if you comment this out, you'll get an error on the roles guard there. So basically what this does is it needs to return some sort of boolean. So that could be a promise boolean or an observable boolean, and based on whether it says true or false, that's what allows it to pass through. So if we are using this roles guard and we say, okay, they made it through the roles guard, that means it's returned true for us, and then the post request has been made. But if they don't have the valid credentials, we'd want to protect against this and say false, and then it won't even actually make it into this post request at all. So one thing we'll need though is we'll need to, because we are using our own custom decorator here, we need to interact with this particular decorator and get the decorator information. And to do that, NestJS has a service that's built in for us that allows us to get that information. So if we just make a constructor here, and then we inject the reflector, that's what they call it, then we'll be able to use that and to be able to do something with that, i.e. protect our route. So of course we need to import this, and this comes from NestJS core, I believe. So what we want to do is we want to say we want to get the required roles that we need here. So in this case, what's been injected in this roles here is the role admin. So that's the required authorization that we need to be able to make the request. So we can just have something here called required roles, and to access the metadata on that particular class, on that function, that endpoint that we're using here, we need to call that reflector service, and there's a method called getOr and override, and this takes a type of the type that you could put in here. So you could have role admin, but you could also have role.user or role.premium, let's say. And if we consider all those types that could be in, we can say, okay, we need the role type, and it's going to be an array of different role types, and of course we're going to need to import that. So in the arguments, what it takes and why I've exported this roles key here is it needs this roles key name. So we can just go ahead and copy that, because that's the metadata that we're setting. So to get that metadata that we're setting, we need to access it. So we can access it through that same way we've set it. So we're accessing through this get method. And as a second argument, it's going to need to know where it's looking, basically. So the class that it needs to be looking at this feed controller class, and it also needs to be looking at this particular endpoint. So it's looking at this create method. So it's looking anywhere in this feed controller class, and it's looking for this create method in particular. That's where we have our guard set and our roles for that roles guard there in the decorator, in the metadata. So this is where the context comes in hand. So this context, and that's coming from NestJS as well, from the execution context, this provides context about the particular location that's calling it. So we'll make an endpoint, we'll send a request to this /API/feed, and the context is needed, so we need to know the controller and the method used by that controller in our guard. So we're able to access the metadata from the decorators that we created in our guard, and then we need some context that pretty much suggests what method we're using and what area. So with that said, we can use the context get handler method, and we can pass that in, and we can also pass in our get class, and this should be an X, and of course this method is happening inside the can activate. So can activate sort of like a lifecycle method in the sense that when you call the roles guard, which is called from just having this roles decorator here and the roles guard being used, essentially this can activate method is just called, basically similar to how a constructor is just called when the class is instantiated. Now we will need to get the roles key in from our decorator where we exported it, and we're just getting an error here because we're not returning anything, so let's just return something. But basically now that we've passed in the role that we require from the user to be signed in as or authorized as for the roles guard, and we've used the reflector to get that metadata and context information about the class, where it came from and what's called, so the handling class, we can say, okay, now if there are no required roles, i.e. you have the roles guard on but there's no roles here, it's implied that it'll just make it through, and then having that roles guard there is basically redundant. So whenever you're using the roles guard, you basically want to have some metadata associated with which role you want to have. So if for whatever reason there is no required roles, it's sort of implied that you've been looking through your code and then you've seen there's some roles and then you sort of delete it, but then you might have accidentally left the roles guard there. In that case, it's sort of assumed that you've allowed access or authorization to that endpoint. So that means we're going to return true, i.e. it passes through the can activate method and it will make it into this post request. What we can do is we can say, and once again we can use the context. So on the context, and there's a method here called switch to HTTP, and it switched the context to HTTP. So we'll see what that means. Essentially what we want to do is we want to call this method called getRequest, and that means for our request it's going to get like an object of information basically. So what I want to do is, we've already seen that we have for our our requests that because we've set up authentication in the previous video, that the user is associated with the request. So we can actually use object destructuring here, and we can get the user from the request, because when you log in you get the token, and then you put that in your headers, and based on that you have information to the author basically, or the user. So you have their ID and other details, in particular their role. So if you have that user, and this should be a method here actually, so based from the request we can use object destructuring to get the user. Now if the roles that we've defined here match the role that you get from Postman based on the login credentials, so if that's true, you're allowed to make the request. So we'd want to return true in our roles guard. But so they only have to have one of these match the 3 roles we have. So there's also a user role. So if some of those, like JavaScript's the function we're going to use, method we're going to use for some. If any of these are in the roles, then that's considered they have the permissions to be able to do that. So what we can say, and if they're not, obviously we want to be returning false here. So for the required roles, and I should mention the shape of required roles. Required roles is basically, it's either, well, if it makes it to here, it's got something in it. So it might have admin in it, or it might have user in it, or it might have premium in it, and it could also have any combination or multiple of that. So for example, could have in our case admin and premium. So since we have this sort of data structure here, we can use a higher order function, an array method. So we can have sum, and what sum does is, what we want to do is we want to check that if any of these, so admin or premium, matches this role here in admin, then we want to turn true. So for any one of these roles, if we have the case, so this is just going to return something based on if it's true or false. So we got the context of our user here, which more or less relates to this user with a role. So if the user, if the role, and we tack on this Elvis operator because it might not be defined for whatever reason, just as an extra safety, although it should be defined by this stage. If that includes something from here, then it will return true essentially. But if it doesn't, it will return false. So I can go ahead and delete this pseudo code we're using as an example, and we can go ahead and we can run our server in development mode by an npm start, npm run start :dev. Let's run it. And it's just mapping the routes. So the application has successfully started. So let's look at the role. So we've said admin and premium will work. So let's see a next case where it doesn't work first. So I've got this John user. So I can log in as this guy, copy the token, paste it into the authorization header, and if I make the request, we get forbidden resource. Now if I do the same thing but with the admin user, we make the request, we get the token, we copy it in, we paste it there, and let's just go ahead and change the body to 678. We make that, and then we see that we've made the actual request. So, and we get the rollback, we get this nested information of the author, the body, when it was created, the ID that it relates to in the table. And just to see everything's working, if we go to our feed post and we go ahead and look at all the rows, we scroll down to the bottom here, we see we get this 678. So we've successfully implemented authorization, role-based authorization. So the next steps from here will be to basically use this in other sections of our application in our API. So we're building a LinkedIn clone. So we're going to want to allow users to delete and edit their post. But what happens if you're a user and now we've implemented role-based authorization? If you're a user, you still more or less have access to be able to change other users' data, basically. So what we'd want to implement next on the back end side of things is the ability to, it's essentially just another guard, and it's just to make sure that the user's logged in as the particular user that they are. And also if the admin or something like that, they can make the request and override that. But where I want to continue off in the next videos, I want to implement this role-based authorization and authentication on the front end side of things. So we've built out the UI, and I want to intercept the requests that we're making from the front end and attach the token, and allow for different things to happen depending on the role type. So if you've liked this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'm nearly at 1,000. I'm looking forward to hitting the 1K milestone mark, and there's going to be plenty more of high quality content coming up just like this. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.